I made the mistake of using the term valid transaction, which apparently labeled me a quote, this is from Mechanic himself, a slippery fuck. They are proposing right now an activation that uses the same methods of the two forks they don't like. And it seems like a lot of people in this group are really fired up about, enacting some sort of fork. I mean, I think this won't be the last proposal that you see.
Most users of Bitcoin view it as a strength of the network that a minority cannot coordinate and censor you, and they are viewing that as a bug.
And if your entire argument hinges on the idea that you have the plebs and there are these like elitist core people who just overruled all the plebs, you're not really making much of an improvement.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions the company sponsors or projects discussed.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another great episode of the Supply Shock podcast. Once again, we're talking about BIP44, the evolving emergency soft fork that's looking to change the rules around Bitcoin, the world's largest cryptocurrency. We're once again joined by a cast of characters here who are all united by their presence in the Knots Telegram channels popping up where discussion is wrapped, happening around the clock globally as folks try to coordinate, figure out consensus, and see what changes to Bitcoin there will be. We'll go around the horn. We've got Rob Hamilton, CEO at Anchor Watch, Joachim Book, him as the editor of Broken Money and Other Properties, also a writer for publications like Reason, and Aaron Van Werdum, author of the Genesis book. You can go find that where books are sold. So let's get into it. This Telegram channel, the people are coordinating. They're out. We're all have had experience over the last 24 hours, 7 days, since there has been a large-scale effort to coordinate folks around deploying a soft fork that would restrict Bitcoin's scripting abilities, stop the spam, enforce the filters. Where should we begin, folks? I know Aaron is basically, in those chats arguing. Maybe we can just do some highlights from our own discussions with this group. Obviously, want to give the benefit of the doubt, want to get to consensus, and don't want to see people fork away. Aaron, what are some highlights from the conversations that you're having?
Well, I can give you the origin story of the chat because I don't know if you even know that, but
I don't think so.
Yeah. So I mean,
well, you were booted out of the other channel, right?
Pretty much, yeah. So there was a Knots channel. I mean, there still is a Knots channel, and I joined the Knots channel because I was trying to get answers on, some of the more perplexing arguments they were making, and I was, sort of trying to understand Luke's perspective, and then by extension, trying to figure out if other people actually agreed with that. So, one of the specific questions is, if the exact same data is in the exact same place in a transaction at a different point in time, then doesn't that make it more or less moral or illegal, which seemed to be the argument, right? If there had been CSAM in an opportune 2 months ago, then that would have been just spam. But if it's there now, that is not, So I went in these chats and I started to ask a couple of these questions. And I guess at some point they thought I was being annoying. In my view, I was just asking questions. I was challenging their logic. I will agree with that, but I was not being rude or anything like this. But I mean, it's kind of the Socratic method, maybe, and Socrates himself, I think, was brought to death for asking questions. So I was banned from that channel.
You were brought to digital death.
Yes, exactly. So I was banned from that channel, which was pretty ironic because I think a lot of the original sort of shitstorm against Core was because Mechanic was booted from their GitHub. So there was some obvious hypocrisy there, if you ask me. And then to sort of, give an out or give an alternative, this new fork channel was booted up, kind of, especially for me, maybe, I don't know. But now it's alive and well, and everyone is sort of discussing the channel there. So
and there's been a lot of people coming in and out. We've seen Paul Stortz drop in to talk a little bit about Drive Strange. I've been there as well. Rob Hamilton. Rob, maybe let's go to you. So Aaron, it seems like, has had an unfriendly welcome. He's trying to get specifics from these folks as they, are proposing to change Bitcoin on a timeline that keeps shifting. What's been your experience since you've been there?
I just around the time Aaron was asking these questions, Mechanic came in to say, "I'm not banning anyone. You don't have to respond to trolls." And I replied, "But I was banned from the Discord." And then he banned me from the Telegram channel within 20 seconds of saying he wasn't banning anyone. So
it was funny because I don't think Rob was involved in the discussion at all. Like, I was discussing with these guys for 2-3 weeks, maybe. Like, I was going over all the arguments, and Rob said one thing.
Well, Rob, from last week's episode, betting openly against the BIP44 fork hasn't earned you any friends. It seems like the reception has carried over to these channels where these folks don't want to put money on the Bitcoin fork proposals.
No. And so the actual origin of the room was after I was banned from the Telegram. I made a post about basically they realized, wait, we should have fork conversation in a different Discord channel because the Knots Telegram is just for Knots technical support, which I had previously given. I was actually helping random people compile Knots on there. You can go through the history and see it. So they made a new room just to talk about the fork, which I was allowed to participate in. I am now banned from discussing futures markets in that room. I am not allowed.
Sounds
to
like
even
you need
discuss
another Telegram channel for that.
Well, my new framing on this is that the futures market is actually the only way you can buy the UASF coins. Because if you buy Bitcoin today, you are economically supporting both chains. So the only way to actually support this chain economically is by participating in a futures market because it hasn't activated yet. Now, this brings on to the new problem, which is Dathan last night just updated the BIP and he removed the deployment section. It just says TBD now. And he has openly mused from his current just straight UASF, no signaling, to maybe a BIP8 signaling method, to maybe a BIP9 miner activated soft fork. So in the past 24 hours, he has gone through basically the entire catalog of all the different ways you can update consensus and has removed all of the activation language from the BIP. So not in a good spot at the moment.
And to this, Rob, Luke tweeted, I don't care what he puts in the BIP. I'm still doing a reactive activation if the alternative is fatal. So there are so many question marks here and they never end.
I think the obvious, if I were to threat model this, what's going to happen is someone is going to false flag the network. Someone intentionally to grief them is going to put that in there. Affiliated or not affiliated with him, I'm not even speculating on who would do this, but someone's going to put something on chain and then Loop's going to reactive soft fork at a moment's notice. And their activation client, I don't even think is fully final yet. So the biggest threat is that what are you going to do if the client's not even final with these new consensus rules yet?
Well, and to that point, so indeed, Luke said for a while now that if there is CSAM in an up return, at least post Bitcoin Core 30 release, I guess, then he would indeed reject that block. But, one of the questions I was asking in that chat, for example, is, well, how would you even know that? Like, are you going to look that up, or what's going to be what information are you going to be based that on? And that question itself was banned from asking. Like, no one was allowed to ask that question, or it was deleted. So it's not answered. You weren't even allowed to ask it anymore, which make of it what you will.
It's not a great way to build rough consensus, though. But
let's go over to Joachim. Have you been active in the channel? Have you been lurking? What have you seen out there?
No, I've been avoiding it. I've been lurking on Twitter and on Noster. And I can't really say that. I mean, this kind of banning from private channel stuff doesn't really affect me that much. And I mean, it's not a nice way to converse. It's not a nice way to build consensus, like you just said. But at the end of the day, you can do whatever you want on your own channels. If you don't want somebody in there, you can kick them off. That doesn't trouble me very much. Like, what troubles me is what these people are saying in public and what they are doing. But
there is some hypocrisy there, right?
Of course,
there was a big backlash for the core developers sort of moderating their technical discussion, so not everyone can come in and sort of crowd out the whole GitHub conversation between the people working on the software. And
a little bit.
Telegram chat that is, I would say, supposed to be used for discussing these things, and
And if your entire thing is, or your entire argument hinges on the idea that you have the plebs and there are these elitist core people who just overruled all the plebs, and then you just kick out people who want to talk about something, you're not really advancing. You're not really advancing the the cause. You're not really making much of an improvement
To
socially.
be clear, I'm not in any way like actually bothered by it. I think there are interesting conversations to be had, and I enjoy having them. But yeah, sure, if they do want to boot me,
Yeah, there
that's
does seem to be like a generic a hostility towards specificity, right? Like, I mean, yesterday, I mean, on the conversation we had last week, right? One of the questions that I had would have been like within the Bitcoin, topology, like we understand that miners, will selectively leave, they serve the network. And so the ask here really, I think, is that like node operators have some sort of, we should expect something else from node operators, right? That like we should particularly care if a large amount of nodes just leave for whatever reason, when, if a large miner left the network, the standpoint of the network would be to disregard that information, right? That those miners are simply just no longer mining on Bitcoin. There's no change that needs to be made to accommodate them. I put that question in Mechanic and didn't get an answer, honestly. And then, I made the mistake of using the term valid transaction, which apparently labeled me a quote, this is from Mechanic himself, a slippery fuck for using for using the term valid transaction, which I asked, well, what is your preferred nomenclature for that transaction? I don't know. I also think that like, as I really had a couple long conversations over the last few days. I don't know. I just feel like, the whole tenor of the conversation is very rushed and there's a lot of strange ironies, right? We've pointed them out here before, but a couple of the ones that really stuck with me yesterday were, if the ask here is sort of, some of these folks are a little bit more technical, maybe like to steel man their intentions, right? They're sort of saying, okay, we have these past soft forks, and these soft forks have repercussions that we don't like. So therefore, what should we do in that instance, right? I'll be very charitable to some of these folks and say like, this is what I would consider like a reasonable argument, right? So the idea that they have is, there's bad stuff going on the network now that's particularly are the results of past changes. And so their question is, okay, well, then how do you invalidate those changes, or do you never invalidate those changes? I actually think that's like a pretty fair line of questioning. And I'm curious for the roundtable's thoughts on this. But I also would say that, like, they are proposing right now an activation that uses the same methods of the two forks they don't like to very hastily, enact a change in the network that would probably just have the same level of results, right? Like there would obviously be some part of that fork that wasn't successful. So they're using like the same, they sort of object to the way that these past changes were handled, but then want to enact new changes in exactly the same way to invalidate them, which is a bit perplexing. But the question really, I think, what do we think of this question let's just say right now it's like, I don't agree that the inscription, envelope is a bug. I don't agree that that is the case because I don't see that there is enough negative harm being had to the network. I don't think it meets that definition. I think it's a fair creative use of the protocol. They think it's a bug. But what do you think of the larger question of, can we go back and invalidate past soft forks if we don't like those changes? That seems to be the general crux of what they're saying, even if we don't agree with the specific.
Yeah, I mean, with enough social consensus and with enough, like if you do this slowly, carefully, and you get 99.5% of the people involved in Bitcoin in one way or the other running nodes and being involved economically, or miners or whatever, and you get everybody to agree, yeah, fine, you can do anything and it won't cause any harm. It'll be fine, right? Like that's sort of how Luke is talking about this. Everybody will follow. It won't be a hard fork because everybody will follow his software. There won't be a split. There won't be a new coin. There won't be rejected blocks. Everyone will just soft fork over to the new beautiful block version, right? So if you do something slowly like that, I'm very sympathetic to that argument that, yeah, there's no harm, there's no problem, right? But nothing about this is done carefully and slowly. Like the urgency is the number one thing that really, really troubles me. Like there's so much like, oh my God, we need to do this right now. We need to activate it by February 1st. And like, what's the harm? And then there's like some hypothetical made up idea of, legal, immoral troubles, and spam is like clogging up the network, and while fees are zero and blocks aren't full. So it's like nothing about this makes any sense to me. So to answer your question, I think you could if you do it slowly, carefully, and as a
So you're just the pace at which it is being made.
yeah.
Aaron, your view about just the, can we go back and, make changes to past changes? If someone finds a creative use like inscriptions, is there some plurality of group that could be able to remove that?
I mean, generally speaking, if you don't have consensus for a fork, then it can split the chain. So that is then the price you have to pay. You have to decide, is this worth splitting the chain over? If your answer is yes, then you can do that. I'm not subscribing to any sort of specific percentage of users that you need. I would say philosophically, you should only make changes if it doesn't harm anyone. Not even a single user should be, should have their coins confiscated or any other sort of risk. I do think, this inscriptions bug or future, whatever you want to call it, I don't think that was really the intended use of Taproot. That said, back when we were, discussing SegWit back during the block size wars, it was a well-known potential downside that you could have blocks with up to 4 megabytes of essentially garbage. Like an attacker, as we talked about it back then, could create nonsense blocks with 4 megabytes of garbage. So now we have blocks with 4 megabytes of garbage, because I do agree that some of this stuff, inscriptions, I think is garbage. But that is a downside that I already accepted. Like, that was one of the trade-offs that we had for having SegWit. It's potentially, possible to have 4 megabytes of garbage, and I don't see any sort of, like, the downside of that is calculated in, at least in my mind, and that means there's no real problem that we need to do anything about, really, and definitely not some sort of rushed soft fork that could split the chain. That's basically insanity. And I'm also kind of past the point of taking it super seriously. Are you guys? Like, is this something that's actually gonna happen in your mind, or where are you with this?
No. I don't think so. And just to directly answer that question, no, I don't think this is going to happen at this point. If it is going to happen, it's going to be Luke doing a reactive soft fork. That's just going to be the only way it happens by himself.
So you don't. I mean, it seems like a lot of people in this group are really fired up about enacting some sort of fork. I mean, I think this won't be the last proposal that you see. I mean, we've already seen it today, where the miner activated soft fork. The different activations for the proposal.
If you were to ask me, is a recession coming? The first question should be, is the market going down? This is why the forward guidance is way more important than the actual policy.
I'm Felix, host of the Forward Guidance podcast, and somebody who's wildly obsessed with all things macro and crypto and where the two worlds collide.
Once we looked at the world through this lens of the debasement of fiat currency, we realized there's actually only two assets that outperform this.
10-year yields went from 360 to 480 in 5 months while the Fed was raising rates. Sorry, Jay Powell, that was a rejection of the policy.
Whether it's Michael Howell breaking down global liquidity or Joseph Wang dissecting monetary policy, we talk to the best and brightest so you can always stay on top of the most important stories driving macro.
You add up tariffs and big beautiful bill, the train is stopped. In fact, it's going in reverse.
A year ago was the first time in 25 years of doing this that every little single thing that I looked at told me to sell.
We cover everything from inflation to interest rates to bonds and Bitcoin and all the biggest forces shaping the global economy. Subscribe to Forward Guidance and stay one step ahead of the next big move.
Maybe we can talk about Muno Knott's, research, because he really dug into the, Aaron was saying no users should be harmed. He really looked at the network. Rob, maybe you saw this thread where he looked at all the different cases where there are transactions that use these different, scripting abilities. And, one of the things I said in the chat that I think is merited is there's a lot of, sort of argumentation around, well, this fork shouldn't, steal people's coins. And I said, well, you can actually make it even, a little bit less serious than that. I think actually, I, as a Bitcoin user, I have the privilege of using all the scripting I want for whatever I want to do that. And you're asking me to give up those privileges because some people are abusing it, right? For that's their point of view, right? That's really the social act. If you think this is social consensus, well, then what is this social consensus saying? It's saying that I have to give up, these scripting abilities. Maybe I'm not even using them, but I have to give them up in order to protect some other people. What do you think of the research there, Rob?
I think it's interesting to show that people are already using and people leverage and use this stuff, right? And part of Bitcoin's the property rights you have as a user of Bitcoin is that it's not going to be seized and taken away from you. And now the counter argument would be, well, this is a temporary soft fork. so it's going to be reactivated. Dathan is already someone earlier today. Dathan was talking to was like, I want to make this permanent. What's up? And then Dathan said, well, I'll make it permanent if there's support for it, right? So instantly, the goalpost shifting is already underway on their side. Of like, maybe it should just be permanent. Maybe we should just get rid of opt-if forever and ever. And then also Taproot, you could only use 128 leads, right? Like it's all of these things that, as a permissionless system, Monot did the work that Dathan should have done before he even made a proposal, right? Like it's just so how premature I'm going to put forward a bit, because anyone who would be trying to break user space and possibly violate users' property rights would put the duty and care into understanding who currently is using the stuff that we can see empirically. Additionally, Greg Maxwell made a really interesting point on the mailing list in that you're now asking people to dox maybe their inheritance plan. Maybe someone did a pre-signed transaction. They threw a pre-signed transaction with a lawyer that unlocks in 10 years and it uses op-if. Dathan is now putting the burden on everyone in the Bitcoin network to come forward and dox all of their tap leaves and say, this is how I planned on spending my money in the future. And it's a wild inversion of the design principles and kind of the user rights people have in Bitcoin that you have to now to justify.
Yeah, this is what the Knots people are. They're the Gestapo going door to door, knocking, and they're asking who you have under the floorboards. I mean, they are essentially, in the Inglorious Bastards, you're hiding under the floorboards, aren't you?
You're hiding in the tap leaves. You're hiding op-ifs in your tap leaves onto you. You're right, like sitting there with the pipe, like I'm unsanctioned op-ifs.
Right, but that's what it is. That's why I don't think the argument about morals and privilege, it's like the ask of any sort of social group that is like stirred to some sort of class hatred is that they then ask the collective to give up privilege. Like this is the war on terror, this is the war on drugs. I mean, this is all of it, right? And I think I can't remember who made the war on drugs analogy, but I think that's really apt, right? It's like we should give up our privileges, we should give up programmable money. Because people can't be trusted to use programmable money responsibly, and therefore, you have to kowtow to the, this collective sort of moral policing over. And I just thought it was interesting, it's that this is really the first fork in Bitcoin, I think, maybe ever. I think you said this on the last podcast, Rob, but it's that takes existing user behavior and actually wants to disable it.
Right.
That's like the net new here. So that, I think there's a lot in this conversation about how, soft forks are common. Oh, we've done user activated soft forks before. It's like, no, you haven't ever done a soft fork. There are none of the big blockers. The big blockers weren't making bigger blocks and then you took away the bigger blocks from them. They couldn't make bigger blocks and they wanted to make bigger blocks. So they went somewhere else to make the bigger blocks. Like they weren't currently making bigger blocks. Like this is a default active user behavior. And it's, maybe it's not economically sensible, right? Maybe the economics of that activity are, pretty local and like how, in the case of some of these inscriptions about how popular they'll be. But, it's very clear that they're persistent. There are people engaging with it. And I made the analogy, right, where it's essentially, I think there's an interesting contrast where it's like the ordinals folks are able to, as a minority within Bitcoin, coordinate amongst each other to conduct the kind of commerce they want within Bitcoin. And then the Knots group sort of sees this as a problem. But the irony is that they can't locally coordinate amongst each other to stop that. That's the problem. That's the problem they have. And so they have to ask the collective to stop the activities of this other minority group, but they don't see it that way, right? And I don't know, my attempts to like interface with that channel have all been like, oh, well, don't you see a problem with asking some how like consensus group, right, of users, that they should take away someone else's things. They just, I don't know. I haven't gotten any of them to actually accept this argument. It always then falls back to like technical minutia of, this is a bug and, fixing bugs is responsible and we have to fix the bugs and this is spam.
I think to succinctly like frame up that point, most users of Bitcoin view it as a strength of the network that a minority cannot coordinate and censor you. And they are viewing that as a bug. That is the actual bug, is that they can't, on a social layer, stop a minority of people using Bitcoin in a way they disagree with, whereas everyone else in Bitcoin views that as a feature.
Yeah, and I've listened to some of the comments. I listened to Nutspan Home, who I quite like, and Jimmy Song, and Tone Base. Another number of people who I've had conversations with and really enjoy as well. And it just sort of comes down to the same sort of thing in all cases. I feel like at this point, where it's like I just don't know. There's just so little on the not side that I can really get behind. I just don't like what they're specifically proposing. I don't like how they're going about trying to propose it. And then I disagree with the actual. There was somebody in the channel who was like, who I like. I can't remember his name. We've had some interactions on Twitter where and he was like, "Oh, well, I'm sure we'd find common ground if we could just sit down." And I'm like, "There's no common ground. I disagree with what you're saying. I disagree with how you're doing it." And I think the larger meta, repercussions of what you're proposing are just completely awful, right? Like they're just terrible. Because if Bitcoin really is just you can just rile up a bunch of people to just, invalidate somebody else's stuff, then I don't at that point it becomes terribly uninteresting to me, and I don't really know how to move forward. But they seem really, it always goes back. There was a line from Nuts Van Home that I thought was interesting where it's like the real Bitcoiners need to send a message to the people who are using Bitcoin who are not really Bitcoiners. And that's the whole it just that's the centerpiece of the problem. It's there's one group who thinks that they have more of a claim on Bitcoin than other users. And this goes back to the same question, that I asked Mechanic about the node operators. It's why do the node operators have that claim? Because you are running a node. What, because you're doing that for free? And so this is where I don't understand. If the claim is that the miners are just being paid by the network, right? That's the claim. And so we don't care if they come and go because someone else will be paid, right? They're just random contractors. But then so the claim then is that the nodes are the ones contracting the miners. That's the claim. But then I'm like, okay, well, how is that? How are the nodes contracting the miners? The nodes don't control the money. It's not like the nodes are issuing the money to the miners. That's not.
Well, no. I mean, okay, I can answer that question. I think nodes contract the miners in the sense of they decide which Bitcoins they accept in a transaction. So what protocol rules they're enforcing in the moment that they're accepting a Bitcoin. So if a miner is mining a block that's invalid according to a node, then the node just says, I don't want that block, and therefore I don't want ultimately the Coinbase reward that you mined. So basically nodes through the acceptance of Bitcoins and inflation, they pay for miners.
You
could also argue for
blocks, and then the node's acceptance of blocks is what confers the money to the miners.
Anytime I accept a Bitcoin payment, I accept Bitcoin that were mined by a miner, right? So the Bitcoin that are mined by a miner are given value by me in the moment that I accept Bitcoin that according to the same protocol rules.
Okay, so you do see the nodes as essentially the nodes being the ones who are paying the miners, and the nodes are providing the free service.
Yeah, because the nodes are the ones validating that there's a block subsidy that the miners can get paid.
But then why do we care that, if there are some subsection of nodes that wants to not follow the rules and process, that wants to invalidate some of these blocks, right? As long as there's enough nodes to continue. Because essentially that's their objection, right?
I mean, you get a fork. When the nodes have a disagreement amongst themselves, you get a fork and you change the rules. And they're trying to bring everyone along so there isn't a fork. And in conversations, their base premise is everyone is going to agree with this, so there won't be a fork. And so they just take that as an assumption, and then they make the next step in their process.
Well, all real Bitcoiners would agree with this,
right?
Yeah. So if you go back to that, so I had some conversations with Knut as well, and he's at some point he was basically saying this is all virtue signaling, and he agreed to that. And I was fine with that position. When this was all virtue signaling, it's actually we want to send a message to the spammers that they shouldn't be here. That's fine. I mean, send all messages.
Yeah, I actually agree with that as well.
That's how you converse in a free society, right? You disagree over somebody's use about something, and you say, "Please fuck off. I don't want your fork off."
Yeah, John Carvalho had a good comment on this, which is the way that you reject those people is you don't do commerce with them.
Yeah, or I don't like you. I'm going to argue with you. This is virtue signaling. I'm going to tell you off for doing something I dislike. That anybody or you in particularly are doing, right? That's perfectly fine. But when you go from there, and I think not up until just including the filters, the relay policies, blah blah blah, all of that was still virtue signaling. Didn't do anything. Didn't do any harm. Didn't lock anybody out of their coins. It was a perfectly fine thing to do. It was sort of a vote and saying, we don't like this stuff. I want this to go away. It was virtue signaling because it wasn't actually making it go away.
Well, new counter argument there is that virtue signaling is just signaling, and that the network, that signaling is crucial to forming consensus, which I also agree with.
Yeah, that's fine. But forking the network is one step further. Now you're no longer. Now you're causing some of the harm that we talked about. This.
Well, you're declaring that you will no longer participate, as long as your demands are not met. And then the question is like, well, what are your demands, right? And then, or even said like, why do you get to make demands? Because I think it's been clear that in past sports, miners have thought that they get to make demands, and then the end result of those forks is that the miners nodes demands, just because they're a node, like somehow more relevant.
Yeah, just to jump in there, I would say that everyone has the right to do whatever they want, right? Bitcoin as an anarchic system. The miners, the nodes.
You can't use that word anarchy. It's not.
That's why I've always believed Bitcoin is anarchy to begin with. But now that that's apparently also a controversial statement, I was Luke said that Bitcoin's not anarchy. It's rules without rulers, and the rules are consensus. That's the entire predicate here, is that we all agree to a certain set of rules, and within those rules, there are no rules. And those rules that we all agreed to are the consensus rules. So within the box of consensus, it is anarchy.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, you can change the consensus rules, of course. And to Dayton Ohm's credit, from what I'm seeing, he seems sort of sincere in trying to find consensus. He does seem to sort of want to hear
asking people.
I think it's a complete dead end. Like I don't think he's gonna. It's gonna. People are gonna disagree at the end.
Well, the stunning thing was like it made sense as UASF, right? Like the idea that like some node operators would want to force a larger network change, right, to prove whether the intolerant minority theory, really extends. Like that made sense. But then like once they now said they're going to do a miner activated software pool, it's like that the miners aren't going to run this. So like what are we even talking about at this point? So I don't know. I've seen some of this backtracking is just sort of like, okay, well, like, I still think the larger value here that I'm hanging out for is like, I would love to personally see like a very unpopular UASF be attempted that is just invalidated by the larger network. That would be, I've always said, like, even as far back as a couple of years ago, it's like, I always thought the danger of this whole situation from like the standpoint of these like real Bitcoiners, UASF folks, is that like, you build the Trojan horse that was built before, and then you deploy the Trojan horse, and then it just doesn't work again. And so now the other economic actors who like have the real power in the network, the miners and the exchanges, now know that the thing that you did in the past, the bluff that you made in the past, like just doesn't work anymore. So you've given up the game. I still think that's the worst case scenario.
I don't know if it was a bluff, but I can sort of steel man your position or something that I thought. I think the first USF or the UESF that we saw was sort of users showing to miners that they can't block a good upgrade. And maybe this time it's the turn for miners to show users that they can't force through a bad upgrade, right? And then you get balance in the system, so to say.
Well, one thing I would say, though, is like, and I think Mr. Hoddle brought this up on X, which is that during SegWit, like SegWit had reached a pretty broad amount of signaling. It's just that the miners weren't, the miners themselves weren't meeting the threshold, right? So like there was like a large period of, there was a year of like 50% signaling, right? Like that where it had, some majority of and it had technical consensus, right? So this was the first UASF on a couple levels where I think. And I maybe this is the ask. It's like I would still like to see UASF under these conditions. Like if it's like a very controversial UASF that like disproves the the UASF model works, I think would be illustrative, right? I would at least learn something from this process. So the question is like, how can we get to a point where we learn anything from this process? And I would like in a miner activated software like for this particular change, like just like. That's almost like the worst form of nothing burger. It's like I learned absolutely nothing about Bitcoin.
Well, depends if it has mandatory signaling or not, right? And I don't know what the latest status is. It seems to change every day. Like with mandatory signaling, it's basically UESF as well. I don't think we mentioned this, but the idea that was on the table, I don't think we mentioned this last week either. The idea that was on the table was to do a flag date activation without any miner signaling.
Yeah, right.
That is basically, I mean, that would almost certainly split the chain. That's kind of a crazy idea, especially because in this particular soft fork, they wouldn't use like upgrade hooks, which benefit from policy rules so that miners that aren't paying attention still don't mine invalid blocks. But in this case, any miner that's not paying attention, let alone a miner that's against the soft fork, would just immediately split the chain on the first block, almost certainly. Like there's almost certainly got to be some transaction that doesn't follow the rules, so they got to check. Or rather than split the chain, I think the more likely outcome is it would just stall these nodes, and it's just a complete nothing burger in that sense. But yeah, go on, Rob.
Yeah, well, this is just maybe like 20 minutes ago in that Telegram chat, people were saying that everyone who is not running a version 30 node is actually for this. Because anyone who hasn't upgraded to version 30 doesn't support this. And yesterday at a conference, Mechanic said 1 out of 5 Bitcoin on the network support this upgrade because 20% of the nodes are nots, which is just economically illiterate, just to be blunt, because there's one node at Coinbase that's managing like 2+ million Bitcoin in a UTXO set. There is not a pro rata distribution of every single node that spins up on the network validating and managing the same amount of Bitcoin. And you can prove that because you can just spin up a node on your computer with no Bitcoin behind it, and that you don't all of a sudden confer that much economic value in the network.
The UASF was premised, like, in the whole language around it, and this has sort of been scrubbed from the most recent conversation, it was about the allowing the economic majority to signal for the upgrade. That was like the whole language. So it wasn't that like the UASF was basically saying that the miners didn't represent the economic majority, and the economic majority's wishes need to be carried out in a way that wasn't, with miners saying, like, there needed to be a check and balance on that. And so, yeah, I don't know. I just think that's particularly novel here, is that there, like, you can't prove that there's an economic majority here. I just think I wouldn't accept that argument. I don't even agree with that. There's 1 in 5.
Right.
I think that's substantially fewer.
I think that's
that's where Rob's futures markets, or maybe I should also say my own futures markets idea, or fork futures idea, that's where that comes in. Another interesting topic to maybe discuss is, because this was happening right now on this chat. Like, Rob, I think you were in a way sort of trying to help like them. Like,
yeah,
if this fork can't reach consensus, like what actually could potentially reach consensus?
Right.
So then, do you want to spitball on that? Like, what could actually be viable in your mind?
Yeah. So the way I teed this up was that you had to view the conversation like this: is that if I were in their shoes, wanting to try and restrict this behavior, and I wanted to have the highest chance of being successful and maximize harm reduction of the health and operation of the network, because from their perspective, the op return specifically is the emergent reason why this is an emergency, is you would narrow the scope to just fixing op return.
That to me is so crazy. Like, how did we get there?
Well, so I teed that up as, like, if you're trying to actually build consensus and save the network from this emergency threat, why don't you specifically target the thing which makes it an emergency, which is the op return? And you would do.
It's not, but that's
it's
the
not.
claim. Right?
I'm taking them at their word.
Yeah, exactly.
And their premises, right? So if you're walking through their premises, is that op return is a unique attack vector, and version 30 specifically relaxing the relay rules is the trigger to make this an actual emergency where we need to do an emergency soft fork. You would just limit that. It would be way simpler for code review. You're only changing a thing. You're not really breaking. You can never prove that someone doesn't have a pre-signing transaction doing something, but no one has a use case for why you'd have a very large non-standard op return pre-signed with your life savings in there, whereas people could use op-if. Now it's very understood that you'd be able to use op-if in the future, right? So having a large non-standard, and also you could just have a health check where, like, if the transaction was made beforehand, you could get one more transaction. But, like, the point stands, you would minimally scope in the change and maximally mitigate all of the risk and the emergency concerns. And Dathan immediately told me, if I have a proposal, then I could put it forward. I was like, sure, op return at 520 bytes, which was what Portland Hodl's original suggestion that kicked this whole thing off in the mailing list. Luke replied to Portland's mailing list post, and then the fact that no one replied to Luke within Portland's thread was taken as, well, this obviously has consensus to move forward because no one objected in someone else's mailing list post. The response I got, though, is like, you go work on that proposal, then I'm working on my proposal. And honestly, like, his proposal doesn't have changing consensus. And also just now, Dathan told me that there are people who have now flipped from opposing this to supporting it since he updated the language. And I said, amazing. Can you tell us who that is? And he said, he'll release the names at a later date. So there's not even like, that's just like, and because it's unfalsifiable. It's just unfalsifiable in the sense of I'm seeing growing support. No, you can't see the data that I see. I'm trying, he'll continue to say, I'm trying to build consensus. But if you propose anything that's not his full omnibus package of a fork, he says, well, that's someone else's proposal. I'm not working on that proposal. So it's like, I'm working for consensus, but it must be exactly how I phrase it is not what the word consensus means. It means that you're going to have to give up to align with other people's definitions and behaviors. And I just find that to be inconsistent.
It's a little believable.
I do think that line of reasoning is in itself also kind of problematic, right? Like the reasoning of, let's narrow the scope and then more people will be on board because there's less harm done basically, or it's not as big of a problem. Like if you take that to the extreme, what's the smallest soft fork you can do? It's like, we'll have a temporary soft fork of one block, and then the upper turn can only be 999, 900, 1 byte smaller than the consensus rule. Why would anyone be against that? Like no one's using it. It's like a totally fine, no one's going to be harmed. But then the argument is, but it can still split the chain. It's still,
it still
some
could split the chain.
or so now you're taking this risk that it could split the chain for basically nothing. So it's kind of a catch-22 in that sense. Like you can narrow the scope.
It was a great idea. I'm just trying to help them make a better case than what they're currently doing, because they could drop all this baggage of the freezing of assets.
This is why I said, like, you have to sort of, like, I think what would be helpful is if someone said in that channel, like, here's a list of the things that would still be allowed in this new fork, because the whole social group is built on, like, we're going to stomp out all this activity. But of course, that's like a false perception, because in reality, it's like Counterparty will still work, runes will still work, like open timestamps will still work, like pretty much all of the offending protocols that if you actually listed them, like someone should actually list out. Even like on this podcast, like, today, like Adam Krellenstein is releasing like a new smart contracts platform that uses the inscription envelope. Like, here's the list of protocols now that like use, this thing. And then if you were to actually do one of these, forks that has the consensus that you're talking about, yes, I agree. It's like reducing the scope would increase consensus. But then paradoxically, it's like all the social consensus is built on this perception that like this change will just negate all of this stuff. And that's not true either. And so they have this is why I've always thought like the Knots group is not a cohesive faction, because they have some people who have unrealistic expectations that they really want all this stuff to go away. And then they have the technical folks who know that is impossible. And then, there has to be some equilibrium. And I think the Knots group will always be torn farther to the extreme by this group that really what they want is to actually eliminate all of these things. And so they're beholden to that camp.
It ends up like the reason you probably can't find consensus on this is because you end up with sort of this Emo Phillips joke, right? With, are you into crypto? Yes. Oh, great. Me too. Just Bitcoin or also other crypto? Just Bitcoin. Oh, great. Me too. You keep going to, do you want a temporary soft fork or permanent soft fork? Temporary. Oh, me too. To 80 bytes upper turn or 160 bytes upper turn. 160 bytes upper turn. Die, you shitcoiner.
Right.
Right. No.
It's a circular firing squad inward. Like it's a purity. It's actually it's an on-chain purity spiral is what it is. They're just going to keep on restricting.
Basically, I decided to just give up the go. Like, I was initially going in and I was like, look, like this is all just a fugazi to like fire the devs, and then eventually you guys will try to fire the miners, and like I would just like for you to get on with it. Like I don't know, like I've accepted that this is what the conclusion of this was. For a couple of years now, since I was talking to Udi about like, how, the trans, essentially like, the anti-trans people, were basically just, majority of the Knots people, were just like, it's it was the social aspects that were eventually going to push this to a head, right? Where there are some people who don't like people using Bitcoin. They don't like core developers who have certain social, behaviors or lifestyles. And then like, they'll eventually just push this group to the extreme. So I just want to see that play out.
Well, I think that's why they also paused the activation conversation, because everyone was like, great, you should jump off the cliff. Go. going like, whoa, okay, let's build some consensus. Let's build some consensus.
It's not great that it would be instructive to our understanding of the laws of gravity if they were to all jump off the bridge at the same time, and like we were to all stay on the bridge. Like we would learn something from this. So, in the same way that we launched, the chimpanzee into space, and like, he was, he furthered the scientific, thought, right? He like that monkey didn't really just die in vain, a awful space gas explosion. Like that monkey furthered the righteous and like a scientific thought and the virtuous scientific thought.
And
Like
and here's the whole point, though, is when they do that fork, since no one's engaging in a futures contract, they just get to hold their Bitcoin, so it actually doesn't cost them anything. They could do this whole performance art and do a block activate. They're block orphans, or they don't even get a new block, and then they decide, hey, you know what, this isn't working. Let's go back to the main chain. They haven't lost anything, right? That's ultimately like they get a free ability to troll the network.
Reputation.
There's a scenario where some people could lose a bit, right? Like if they have just enough hash power to sort of fork off into their own chain and become like an altcoin. That's possible. It's one of the scenarios.
And that's where Ocean is important, is that Ocean ensures that they will almost certainly have enough hash power to continue on their own chain.
I mean,
It
if
would
their
take
hash
them
rate still
6
leaves the
hours.
pool.
It would take them 6 hours if they didn't lose any hash rate to find a single block.
Sure. It's all for the cause, comrade.
Right. But then I think to your point too, Pete, is that it will turn into, we fork off, okay, the miners, because they did not follow the true Bitcoin, are provably malicious, and now we need to do a proof of work change. Right? That's what you do, is you say, this was the litmus test. All of the miners are malicious. They're not following the real Bitcoin. So then you just fork and remove that proof of work, and then you're back to CPU mining in your basement, and you have an
there's
alt
just
chain.
like too much dancing. Like, I just really want to get to the climax. This is like a 3-hour movie at this point, where it's like, or no, you know what? It's like, when Inscription started, I expected to sit through a long movie, but now this is like a trilogy, or like, it was like, or Disrespecter, and that was like movie 1. And then the second one was Knots. And now we're in like now it's like, oh my God, it's like, or maybe even we're rebooting. Like now this is like, this is like a prequel attached onto the original trilogy. It just like keeps going. And it's like, I don't know. I would find it, I do think there's something to be said, like, with the Bcash folks who forked off, like, it sucks that they lost their money, but like they actually did help us understand how blockchains and Bitcoin work, right? Like they did contribute to their knowledge. And so, if the Knots folks could contribute to the knowledge, right? If like they really believe this stuff, right? If you really actually do believe this, then I would prefer to see a fast UASF that just, doesn't work. That would be the best. That I would prefer that. As someone who doesn't go along with it, I would prefer to see that. And then backtracking on that now just makes me disappointed, because we won't learn anything. And if we don't learn anything, what are we doing here?
How much of this do you think is, so I mean, looking back at the block size, we're a little sad that Johnny isn't with us in spirit. How much of this do you think are conversations about vision for what Bitcoin is, how it's supposed to be used, what it is that we are seeing? How do you think it's like eternal sort of conversations, the same conversation that they had in
It's almost entirely, I think, at this point about the endemic rights of like the current folks using Bitcoin, and whether they have the ability to say to some group of people who want to use Bitcoin for some other things, like whether they can do that. Because like that's the whole social view. It's right. Like the Nuts Van Holm is like the real Bitcoiners. That is their word. The real Bitcoiners. There are real Bitcoiners. Right. They believe intellectually that it is possible that there exists a group of people called real Bitcoiners that are more Bitcoin than people who are actively using the software according to the rule set, and that these people are less Bitcoin than them. This is what they think. This is what they think. That's what they think. And so, like, if that is what you think, the funny way that I've thought about this is like, okay, well, then how is Bitcoin not a DAO? I had this conversation with Tomer Strolite about this. I was like, well, then how is Bitcoin not a DAO? But, they don't really understand DAOs enough to understand, like, the actual, discussion there. Not to demean Tomer. I really like Tomer and some of his thoughts. But I think that, like, this idea that, like, you have some stakeholdership in Bitcoin because you're using Bitcoin a certain way, and someone who's using Bitcoin another way has less stakeholdership than you, makes almost no sense to me. And I think it can't make sense from the core developer standpoint. It's like a user of the software is someone who uses software for anything. I mean, if you're running the software, so like if you're running a Bitcoin core node to validate your inscriptions collection, how could you plausibly, from the standpoint of Bitcoin, the software, be less of a stakeholder than somebody who's running knots and not even transacting? It just makes no sense. And since they really believe that that's the crux of it, they believe that there should be some way for the software to give them some sort of status, from like they want some sort of clout like within the network for behaving a certain way. And that's just like, that's not a technology problem. That's just like, you have unrealistic expectations of Bitcoin as a there's no way for the technology to confer that to you. Like how would Bitcoin, the software, actually award you that? And it can't. Like it can't solve that problem for you. And so that goes back to my thing, which is that knots is a technical solution to people's emotional problems. And like this is the thing. It's like I can't there, like no one in the world can make you more Bitcoin than someone else using Bitcoin. Like Larry Fink is a Bitcoiner,
Equal
like,
property rights. Everyone has the same right and permission claim to the network. And the moment you make it a meta evaluation, it's like an attempt to make a psychological, moral evaluation of how you use Bitcoin and jumping it into the literal opcodes that get used on chain. Like you're making like this magical leap of like we have these philosophical principles and now we're going to try and insert that into the code, and not everyone's making that leap. Most people are not making that leap. They're
yeah,
saying,
I don't,
which
I
is
don't
legitimate.
think, I don't think that leap makes any sense, because I think it requires the developers of Bitcoin to then have a perspective that makes almost no sense within the domain of technology. It's like the domain of technology, and the whole point of technology is that tools have equal access. Like I pick up a hammer, it's a hammer. You pick up a hammer, it is also a hammer. Like a tool needs to be equally usable. Like, so a hammer doesn't care if I'm a carpenter.
Yeah, the only way that this ultimately goes back to would be a set of whitelisted script spending paths, and this is something that's been floated around too. That you would have to submit to the protocol, and you'd say, "This is the script template path I plan on using. Can you please change either consensus or the policy rules to allow this to be relayed?" And that just makes all of a sudden now Bitcoin Core the permission gatekeepers on how you're supposed to be able to use Bitcoin. That is the only ideologically consistent way at the end of the day you could get there. And even then, people will just find ways to put arbitrary data into those constructs. So, like, you kill Bitcoin and you don't even get your mission accomplished.
Yeah, going back to Joachim's question, and I'm also I'd like to Rizzo on this, because he's sort of the sociologist, right, of the bunch. Is that I do get the impression that at least for some subsection at least of this group, the block size wars were like a very important part of Bitcoin's history, and it's gone down with this sort of mythos of the people, the Bitcoiners fighting for the network, and the winners of the block size wars sort of came out of it as like heroes, and they protected Bitcoin. And there does seem to be a sort of nostalgic sentiment from these users that they now also want to sort of play their role in that way. They want to fight the new wars and be the new heroes that protect Bitcoin in the same way.
Was there a question there?
I was proposing something to you while you were on your phone.
my wife's at the supermarket, like trying to get like our order pickup. It's a disaster. But yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, there's this, like, I think we talked about this early in this where it's like when you're building Bitcoin monocultures, like social groups have to have like a relationship with the past, right? So like even within modern America, right, like the conservatives have like a strong link to the founding fathers, and it's sort of expected that if you're like a large political coalition in America, that there's some, the Democrats might identify more with like the 1930s, right? But so everybody's always reconstructing history, like to their own benefit.
No, but it's a good question. So like I'm definitely of the opinion, or my reading of early Bitcoin history is that there is some ideological undertones. It's not a neutral tool. We're not making a hammer here. Like they are making something that has ideological ideas baked into it that you can't get out of. Right, I think that's true. Like you guys are the historians here. Aaron, wrote the book on the prehistory. Right, is that a fair read? And if so, how is it not what we're talking about?
I mean, that is probably the part where I disagree with Rizzo, right? As we've also discussed in previous episodes. Like, I do think that Bitcoin was invented for a specific reason. It was invented to be used as cash, as electronic cash, to make monetary transactions. Like, I agree with all of that. Like, that's That's where I, see eye to eye with someone like Mechanic. I just think that anything you're trying to do now to like stop inscriptions, never mind some of the stopping smart contract protocols. I think that's completely nonsense altogether. I think that's a perfectly fine use for Bitcoin. But, stopping images on the blockchain, I get, I don't think Bitcoin was intended for that. That's not why Satoshi came up with this idea. So I do see it as, it's kind of an abuse of the system. I just don't think stopping it is worth it at all. Like, it's not a real problem that needs to be fought.
Both groups have selectively rewritten history to their benefit, right? And so the real time is the litigation of the current view of the past, right? And so the Knots group goes back to the Opportune Wars and says, okay, we told these people to leave and they made all these other cryptocurrencies. That was good because they have their whole version of the things. The inscription people say, oh well, Satoshi embedded the Genesis block, and one of the first transactions was for JPEG, right? So they both have their social groups will always have a historical lineage that builds on actual factual events. They have to, right? And in this case, both of them, I think, are making logical claims, right? And so but I think the one that it's more worth litigating is the people's claim that the Opportune Wars were somehow instructive or valuable, right? Because their claim is that rebuffing the crypto market was good because that stuff isn't on Bitcoin. And this is where I feel the Knots people sort of deviate from the old Bitcoin maximalism. I sent Rob a DM the other day and I said, what is Bitcoin maximalism if not an attempt for every transaction in the world, every consenting transaction in the world to be consensus valid? That at one point was the dream, was for Bitcoin to represent all of commerce. And, this Knots group sort of rejects that the crypto sphere is logical, rational commerce. That's actually what they think. And so what am I supposed to do with that claim? I can't sure, it's it might be possible that these folks who are trying to rebuild crypto type architectures on Bitcoin aren't successful, and reality might invalidate their attempts, to do that. But you saying that they shouldn't attempt that because you are already convinced that those transactions are useless, even though there's a 10-year market that shows that these digital assets have that stable coins have value. There's this whole market. There's there's 30% of the market beyond Bitcoin. And so the Knots group really simply just it's more worth arguing this claim. The Opportune stuff is kind of irrelevant. The Satoshi stuff in the blocks is irrelevant. The root of their actual claim is that the rest of the crypto market is a scam. That market is going to zero. And that not only that, no one should even try to reconstruct it on Bitcoin for any reason, because we already know that. And so they have a preconceived notion that they abide to, and they require everyone to conform with that. That's the whole basis of the anger at Citria.
Right.
Even though Citria's goal is indistinguishable from Blockstream's goal, and when Blockstream employed 70% of the core developers.
Yeah, so I disagree with that in the sense that as far as I'm concerned, they're free to try. As far as I'm concerned, there's a free market for block space, and all these nonsense projects can do their thing. And I actually believe that censorship-resistant transactions in the hardest money ever invented will be highly demanded, and therefore it will price out these other things. I don't think we need to fight it in any other way. That's just a waste of energy and might do harm.
I agree. And I think this is actually why all of this effort is being put into all of these other things in this fork proposal. The limiting of the tap leaves explicitly is a rugging of Citria and BitVM machines. Any sort of company using a BitVM whatsoever, they're not actually concerned about people using the control block to stuff data up to 4 kilobytes that. They could put forward that's the reason why, but this whole idea of rugging the scammer. So we need to basically cut off parts of consensus they may be interested in using to make sure they can't even go anywhere near it. And it's done under this pretense of it's only temporary. They just have to wait a year. It is just largely just unfounded, right? This idea that they're going to be able to come in and now we're going to have another one maybe in a couple of years if someone finds a new way to be able to do advanced things they don't like on Bitcoin, right? And I think it also kind of goes to many, I would say in my interactions, most of the people I talk to that are on the other side are people who came into Bitcoin 2020 or later in the past 5 years. And so they were sold a certain sociological, an anthropological story of what is Bitcoin? It's pure money, it's digital gold. when I got into Bitcoin in 2013, the whole idea was that anything of value that exists on these other chains will eventually come back to Bitcoin, right? People don't even realize this. SegWit was first activated on Litecoin. Like, we used those places as testing grounds to go off and do things before they came over to Bitcoin itself. And I think it's just like a different, like, there's like a schism just in like the actual understanding of the history of how Bitcoin got to this point and what is Bitcoin. And I think that's why they're also very set on making sure that they're not giving up on all of the 7 different consensus rules they're changing. They want to champion the op return one as the reason why this is an emergency. It must be done right now. We'll figure out a more permanent thing later. Also, if you ask them what is the permanent solution they're going to put forward to fix it, they say that's not my problem. You can work on that proposal yourself. And it's like, wait a second. You're the one saying there's an emergency. We need to do a temporary fork under the pretense that there will be a permanent fix to all of this. You need to show your work and show that there is a permanent solution to this, because the people who oppose you say there is no permanent solution. So the burden is on you if you're changing the network to bring that full course. So I think that's where, like, at first I thought the taproot, the tap leaf restriction was all to this libitboot protocol that Stu TXO came up with, that like you can put a little picture in the taproot control block. It's not really that. It's about just totally gutting Citria. And they actually proudly proclaim, like, we're rugging the scammers. They're going to be kicked off of Bitcoin. And they're just not going to, like, it's not a sustainable path, because people are always going to find new ways to do things that they don't like on Bitcoin. Like someone I just saw on the ARC protocol with Arcade OS, they're about to launch ARC CryptoPunks NFTs. Okay, so are we going to break HTLCs now because they use Lightning? They're doing scams with Lightning. Like, we should probably just get rid of HTLCs too, because the moment you get any sort of, this is a problem just in general, any sort of programmability you give to Bitcoin to be used as money, other people are going to be able to use it for non-money, speculative, degenerate gambling or any sort of other parts you don't like. You're not able to disambiguate the money, the use of Bitcoin as programmable money for monetary uses and non-monetary uses, because those tools have to necessarily be democratized to everyone on the network.
Is it worth digging into the claim that one of their main arguments is that, in the first op returns war, it sort of scared Vitalik away, and that's why this signaling should now be done as well, to sort of, get rid of these projects now as well. I don't think that, I don't believe that claim even is gonna work. I think that was just a very different time. The world has changed. The world around Bitcoin has changed. Everyone has learned a lot more. One of the things we've learned is that Bitcoin developers are not in charge of the protocol, right? We're talking about 2014 era, where it was maybe much less clear that was not the case. You still had Gavin Andreessen, and before that Satoshi, and they were making changes much more whimsical. I think now that's not actually expected. The block size wars had not happened. So at that point, it was not clear what the block size was going to be. So there was also a much better reason to resist these kinds of use cases, because if the block size limit is just going to grow, then it's a much bigger problem to have all this other data in the chain. So we just live in a completely different time right now. And I think this same argument that if we just sort of, signal that they're not welcome, they're going to go away, I don't think that's going to fly anymore, as we've seen with something like Citria, because they couldn't use op return, or at least, was more difficult for them to do, and they used fake pub keys. They didn't go away. So I think the world has completely changed, and that argument is just not going to fly.
Not to use another example, but Satoshi did also tell the WikiLeaks people to go away, and that didn't work out.
It didn't work out either, right? I think, just very quickly, it comes back to, I think, a credible point that is raised. I know these are blurred lines given the people who are championing the soft fork, but specifically the mission of Ocean and like this decentralization of money. Like, the reason why it's trivial now to bypass all this stuff and that like the old ways don't work anymore is that there's 8 mining pools, which are like 90% of the hash rate. So if you can just do an out of band transaction to like 8 people, you're able to bypass the entire peer-to-peer layer. If there were 100 1% hash mining pools, it would be harder to do that. But in 2014, with the op return wars all the way back then, Bitcoin was very nascent. The technology had only existed for 5 years. People didn't understand deeply the game theory and kind of like the evolving incentive structures of everything. And now something like a Slipstream can exist, and I can go to a web page, drop a transaction hex, and it gets broadcasted, and I get to bypass everything. And all of the other mining pools say, hey, that's open money. I also want to do that. We saw that with Subsat V1 Sat V-Byte Summer. right? 99% of the nodes were running that filter. It still got in anyway. We're understanding that kind of like the strong forcing function of being able to, if you have economic demand and you're willing to pay market price to get into a block, the miners are just not incentivized to not have that stuff in their blocks anymore because they're maximizing their economic output.
Yeah. What is your view, Aaron, on whether so if nodes are sort of paying the miners for the activity of creating blocks and then sort of accepting their acceptance sort of confers that payment, what then of block space? What is the like who's the owner of block space? Because the nodes, it seems like the knots group, again, the root of this idea that like your node is your property, they seem to sort of have this view that they also own block space. Like, what is your view of that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I would say that's where they're wrong. That's what the miners can sell. That's what a miner sells when it mines a block. It's the block space. Now, the nodes can decide how big a block can be. Or, I mean, I guess they can, they can impose other rules as well. But, again, you fork yourself off the network if you're not in consensus with the rest of the network. If you don't want to fork off from the rest of the network, you shouldn't do that. But I mean, yeah, in principle, a node can decide not to include certain transactions or not to accept certain transactions in the block. It's just forking time then. That's it. I mean, but you can do it. I mean, I think what you're trying to get at is maybe something along the lines of, does a node have that right? Or is it like the right thing to do for a node? I would say, that's maybe a worthwhile discussion to have on sort of ethical or moral level, but you don't have to go there. You can also just out of self-interest make that argument in the sense that, one, you don't want to fork off from the network, and two, it's kind of like that poem, right? First they came for the whatever. Like, if you want a censorship-resistant network, then you need to stand, because you don't want to be censored later, then you need to sort of resist the first act of censorship. Either everyone has censorship or ultimately no one does. And I think there's a good reason also for self-preservation to just reject any form of censorship out of the gate.
All right, guys, let's put a bookmark in it. Appreciate you all being on the roundtable. Of course, lots more discussion out there in the Telegram channels and the social sphere. I'm sure this will not be the last time we chat about ongoing fork drama in Bitcoin. We go around the horn. Tell everybody where we can find out where you are and what you're doing, Rob.
Yeah, I'm Rob1Ham on Twitter, ROB, the number 1 HAM on Twitter X. You can find me there.
Shouldn't you shield the Predix bet as well?
Yeah. So Predix actually updated their infrastructure, so now it runs way faster. If I look at the market right now, I think it's currently sitting at roughly 2% likely activate by March 1st.
With the biggest bet they've ever had, the biggest liquidity they've ever had, 6 million sat.
Yeah, 6 million sat of liquidity in the market right now. I think especially because they're changing the activation rules, this probably should go down even more. But because they're kind of pushing off on even having an activation, because this will be February 1st. I thought March 1st was a good contingency. They'd moved it. That, and also if you're interested, if you really want to believe in the UASF and you want to buy some USAF coins, I think I'm the only person who's made a market for them right now, so hit me up for that as well.
Awesome. Joachim Buick, you can find me on Twitter, Joachim Buick. I write for Reason Magazine and for the Daily Economy.
Ervan Werdum, author of the Genesis book. You can find me on Nostr, mostly actually, or Twitter, Aaron Van W.
All right, for now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast. Appreciate you tuning in.